Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It's your host Union, and let's get started here in the direction of Novomykhai. The Russians have here launched an offensive operation with armored assaults, gaining control over the Ukrainian fortifications to the southwest of Novomykhai. As you can see in this picture here, there is geolocated footage confirming this advance by the Russians and their full control over the fortifications here to the southwest of Novomykhai. And on top of this, we have this map by Syriac Maps, which also shows the topographic advantages of this fortification. It is located on the high ground, not just towards the eastern and southern direction, but also in the northern direction towards Novomykhai. With this, the Russians have all the high ground in the southern parts of Novomykhai under their control, while in the northern parts there's only a small section left under Ukrainian control. It is likely that the Russians will look to gain control over these heights to the north of Novomykhai before finishing off the town by gaining full control of it and pushing onwards towards Pereskovivka and Konstantinivka here to the west of Novomykhai. We're entering a new stage in the fighting here to the south of Marinka, where the Russians will look to outline their map by gaining full control over the road between Marinka and all the way down south to Vuhledar to gain control over the eastern parts of the Ukrainian defensive position here to the south of Marinka. We see that there are numerous layers of defenses, mainly around Kurakhove here to the west of Marinka, which has now turned into a fortified town. We see that there are layers of fortifications to the south, west, and east of it, which means that the Ukrainians are looking to hold onto it at all costs from all directions. And above it is a defensive line going in a southern direction, facing if the Russians were to advance to the south of these locations towards Pokrovsk, they'll be able to hold a defensive line there. This discourages the Russians from attacking here in the western direction, as there's heavily fortified positions, and the main target would be Pokrovsk, which in the direction of Avdiivka is much closer logistically. We also see that in the direction of Vuhledar, the fortifications here are less significant than further west and northwards, so it is likely that the Russians are looking here to gain control over the road, after which they would like to gain control over the fortifications ahead of the road, moving down south towards Vodiane and then further south to Vuhledar. Gaining full control over the eastern parts would allow the Russians to have a southern flank of the city of Donetsk and the Russian positions to the east of it. Securing that would allow the Russians to then start pushing towards Kurakhove here in the north and west of Pervomaiske, as well as Avdiivka towards Zhiratyne, and allow the Russians to then launch an attack towards Pokrovsk from 3 separate directions. This would be a large offensive, which could be part of the upcoming Russian summer offensive, launching an attack towards Pokrovsk to capture the city. Capturing the city of Pokrovsk would be the biggest possible hit on the Ukrainian supplies and logistics within the Donetsk region. Moving further north here to the west of Avdiivka, the Russians have managed to make a front line along the river line all the way from Semenivka and then down south to the northwest of Tonenke. And with their borders closing in on Umanske, we see that there's going to be launched an assault by the Russians either towards the fortifications or directly towards the village, as they look to advance further and flank the Ukrainian positions here in the north and to push towards the Ukrainian positions here by the riverline and lakes here to the west of the Russian positions. The goal here would be to establish a strong flank here to the southwest of Avdiivka. Creating a strong flank here to the south would allow the Russians to then start launching operations towards the heavily fortified areas of the Ukrainians west of Avdiivka, and this again would be another part of the operation towards the city of Pokrovsk here to the west of Avdiivka and part of the Russian summer offensive. It is likely that the Russians will continue offensive operations until they launch this massive offensive, and it may even be the case that this massive operation will continue for a long time. Before we get more into that, we have to take a look here to the west of Vuhledar, where the Russians have crossed over the river line and have established positions here to the west of the river line, and fighting continues in the western bank of the river line between Avdiivka and Semenivka, as the Russians are also pushing towards Semenivka with their foothold within the village. After the confirmed advances by the Russians here into the western parts of Berdishi, it was reported that the Ukrainians recaptured the northern parts of the village. This indicates that the Russian advances to the north of the village last week is likely a diversion for the Russians to then split Berdishi from Semennivka and allow the Russians to then exert pressure on Semennivka and Berdishi both at the same time. Rather than cutting off the supply line, they're looking to separate the two villages and attack them one by one. Whether it is Berdishi first or Semennivka first, we don't know. We'll have to see as time will tell. We then move further north here in the direction of Bakhmut, where to the west of Ivanivsky we have the geolocated footage confirming the full control of Ivanivsky on Russian hands. In the meantime, there are reports of Russians advancing towards Chasiv Yar and gaining a foothold here in the forest line, capturing it completely, and now being within visible distance of Chasiv Yar, as in seeing the city with their own naked eyes. And with this, we see that the Russians are very close to actually starting their storming of the city. They'll look to gain control over the eastern parts, east of Canal, before moving on and gaining control over the forest area. Where looking closer towards the map, we can see that there is this crossing here between the eastern and western sides of the canal. This will allow the Russians to move infantry across in large numbers under the cover of the forest area, as well as with a distance here within the canal line that they can just cross over on foot. At the same time, there is this bridge here to the east of Chasiv Yar, which the Ukrainians are using for their supplies. And yet again, another area here to the north where there's more crossings across the canal line and connected with the forest areas. So it is likely that the Russians will continue pushing through the forest areas, gain control over the east of Chasiv Yar, push down towards the southern parts here in the forest area and pushing through the forest area to the north to allow infantry to cross over. And then once the infantry is over and have secured a foothold across, they can create their own pontoon bridges across or rebuild some of these bridges that were already present to then allow armored vehicles to cross over. But so far we're seeing that the main fighting taking place is infantry assault groups launching attacks across the forest areas and against the Ukrainian fortifications with support of armored vehicles, with a lot of artillery and drones flying on both sides. With the situation over the past months continuously being in Russian favor as they advance and have a net increase of advancements above 50 square kilometers for the past few months, we see that the Russians are continuously on the advance. The momentum that the Russians currently have is not slowing down either. Instead, the fighting is actually intensifying, and this is to the detriment of the Ukrainians. We have this doorstep by NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, where he says in this that the situation for the Ukrainians on the battlefield is very difficult. We see the situation on the battlefield, we see how complex it is and what demands will be made on Ukraine. Russia is constantly increasing its military capabilities. Ukraine urgently needs help, Stoltenberg said. To understand what he's saying, and not what he's actually saying, but what it means, is that the Russians are increasing their military capabilities, the Ukrainians are not, and that is because of the lack of aid from the West, because the Ukrainians cannot do it themselves. All they are doing right now is mainly focused around the drones, which is a significant part of the resistance that the Ukrainians are doing against the Russian army. However, they cannot build their own tanks, they cannot resupply and get their planes and all these heavy equipments that the Ukrainians would need to recapture territory. At best, what they're doing right now is to help them hold the country for as long as possible, but this is increasing the human casualties that the Ukrainians are taking. At the same time, we have this article by Politico, it's an opinion article. Ukraine is at great risk of its front lines collapsing. According to high-ranking Ukrainian officers, the military picture is grim and Russian generals could find success wherever they decide to focus their upcoming offensive. The fortifications the Ukrainians have built will be nothing but to slow down and inflict casualties on the Russians. However, the Russians have recruited enough soldiers and have built a large enough army to sustain those casualties and break through these fortifications, which would allow the Russians to collapse a Ukrainian defensive line. We will see advances by the Russians similar to the first days of the invasion, which allowed the Russians to gain control over the majority of the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, as well as major parts in the north and east of the country. The biggest challenges and issues for the Ukrainians is their lack of supplies and manpower. The biggest challenges and issues for the Russians is the Ukrainian fortifications. And with this, we see that the Russians, as more time goes by, they'll become stronger and stronger than the Ukrainians, which would subsequently increase the risk of the Ukrainians' frontline collapsing under the pressure of the Russian armed forces. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content I upload regularly.